Gentlemen, thank you. I believe you would agree that the lines are drawn as to those who are in favor of the Articles of Confederation and those who are in favor of the Constitution. For the next 15 minutes, we will let all four of these gentlemen debate. And while they're doing that, get out your cards and write out your questions. We'd like to get the ushers to come up and be available to pick these up. And gentlemen, if you would, for the next 15 minutes, please.
Well, Henry, I defer to your first question to the two gentlemen, and if you would allow me to second, and then I look forward to their questions to be directed to us.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. As my friends here tonight will recall, Mr. Jefferson accused me of fear-mongering, did he not? Was that not an accusation against me? Yet, would you, Mr. Dupin, would you say that the problems that you have identified were in fact the consequence of the gargantuan power granted to this federal government under our Constitution?
I do think so, yes, because within the first 10 years after the Constitution was in place, after 1791, what we had a Constitution that not only sent Washington and an army going after tax evaders during the Whiskey Rebellion, we had the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act, which Mr. Jefferson vociferously fought against, which made it a federal law to cage you or do whatever ill they could do to you for criticizing federal officials and federal law. So yes, I do think so.
And Mr. Greenhow, you mentioned the Louisiana Purchase, but that is a deceptive statement on your part, because the Louisiana Purchase took place after the Constitution had been ratified. So to suggest that the Articles of Confederation would have somehow prevented the Louisiana Purchase from taking place is total artifice on your part, is it not, sir?
I think it's a very fair guess.
A guess. And that is what he is asking you to turn in your freedom and liberty in exchange for the manacles to be placed on you by an all-powerful federal government. Mr. Jefferson.
I should like to ask Mr. Greenhow first. I was delighted to hear your comments about making a more perfect union. A more perfect union for whom, you say? The states or the people?
The people, sir.
And for what reason, sir? Why not the states?
Well, to quote yourself, which is usually a safe undertaking, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. And I noticed that despite Mr. Henry's fears for the chains of consolidated government, that now that we live under our Constitution, which replaced the Articles of Confederation, I did not see the mixed monarchical government of Great Britain running over the ocean to adopt our system so that they could have greater tyranny and consolidated power over their subjects. No, they preferred their system to ours because they realized that our system was a system of checks and balances and separations of powers. And, if I may say, it is our peculiar security to have put our system down as a written document. Jefferson has said as much. His oft-opposing cousin, John Marshall, has said the same thing, that the greatest improvement on political institutions America has given to the world is the example of a written Constitution, which can be studied closely and should be, to know what powers are delegated and what powers are limited and what powers are reserved. And that, I noticed, has created quite an influence around the world.
I must say, Mr. Greenhow has said that we should take comfort in the fact that Great Britain did not adopt our Constitution. Well, could it not be that Great Britain was too wise to adopt our Constitution? It could be the exact opposite reason that Mr. Greenhow is telling you as to why the Constitution was not adopted by Great Britain. So, Mr. Greenhow, I think to say that because Great Britain failed to embrace our Constitution is somehow something we should take solace from, it could be quite the opposite.
Nay, Henry, you want to run errant, if you will, on your knowledge of the law, the precepts and the principles of English law. English law, citizens, as you know, is a collection of the experience of the English-speaking peoples. It is passed on one generation after another. It is a system of law that is wont to reflect their particular improvement of their condition, their greater enlightenment of knowledge, their greater support of one and the other, particularly in their safety and defense of person and property. You may remember, citizens, that indeed we were Englishmen before the American Revolution, and yet we were denied the privileges, let alone the representation, of the American experience in the British Parliament, and thereby, citizens, one of the essence that brought about the American Revolution is that the English would not accept the American experience in their evolution of the laws. What makes you think, Henry, that they would then accept the American experience in drafting a constitution to take upon themselves? No, Henry. Monsieur Poupert, with pleasure. I'm delighted to think that Henry, who referred to me as returning from France so Frenchified that I've come to abjure my native victims, would refer to you in that manner that I most desire indeed. Oh, I have come to love you. Guillaume, my pleasure. Thomas Jefferson. Name. I beg your pardon, citizens. I love the languages, I love the people. I ask you, if you will, what is the sole purpose of government?
The sole purpose of government, in my estimation, is to control. The sole purpose of government, as we have discovered, is this. How many people, and I will ask on the stage, I will ask here in the entire audience, are the best and brightest in the political class representing us today and have they through history? Or does it attract, as one would say, the scum rises to the top, present company accepted, sir, that for the most part, politicians tend to be venal. They tend to be aggrandizing. They tend to be greedy for their own power and expanding their power. They tend to be people who aren't concerned about those they serve, but only serving themselves. I'm talking about the American experience here. What we've seen in government in this country metastasizing over time is that, for instance, we have swap rates on raw milk producers. We have the federal government going after homeschoolers. We have the federal government telling people that if your tangerine isn't a specific diameter, you may face caging and arrest. That's insanity when you think about it, having that kind of overreach. So I think that, as you and I discussed when we dined together earlier, Bubert's corollary to Acton's axiom is that power attracts the corruptible. Those people who seek higher office have a psychopathy, have a sociopathy to rule over others.
I want to shudder with fear. For it is quite obvious, is it not, that Monsieur Poupert enjoys reading not only Machiavelli's The Prince, but also Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan.
Indeed.
A recognition of human nature in its greatest essence to be corrupt and deceitful, that we are all born so, there is no hope except a government to control us, to direct us, and indeed to hammer upon us, as some would think it ought to be. And yet, sir, I know, for you are a man of enlightenment, to understand Hobbes, let alone Machiavellian, that there is Mr. Locke.
Excusez-moi,
Mr. Locke, sir, allow me a moment. You have your own Mr. Locke, sir, who believes that the essential nature of man is goodness and beneficence. And that indeed we're left free to reign, then that government governs best, which governs least, and yet I will not deny that there are those corrupt and deceitful who with the greatest of liberty will conceive plans and schemes of stock jobbing and speculation, will they not, to take to the goodness of the people what small false monies they may have in their pockets to provide energy unto their schemes and move the citizen body in the direction that a few of great property and wealth may desire, and once realizing they can no longer sack from the citizen body any further support, they say the time is up, we must grab what we have and leave, and it falls upon whom? The people. The people. I remind you, Monsieur Poupert, that indeed the element of doing good in Locke's opinion and mine is self-evident. For when one does something good, it makes them feel good. Is that not how the people would rather feel and be protected and defended in their associations? Oh, no, sir. May I say that you may consider that the purpose of government is to control, as Mr. Hobbes could purport, or Machiavelli in his schemes. I purport that the sole purpose of government is simply to protect us from injury by one another, each and every soul to be protected and defended. And in that regard, indeed, to allow more goodness to be encouraged than deceit and corruption. For I grant you this, should you discover deceit and corruption within a government, to find that anyone elected to public office will be dishonest, immoral, or will they not be so in any walk of life? And if the people allow it there, then indeed, sir, they will elect it to office and follow you to anarchy.
Locke and Payne, I agree with you.
Gentlemen,
Hobbes,
thank
I agree
you.
with
Gentlemen, the debate goes on and rages on. Mr. Henry,
But the cause
Mr.
of the
Henry has a
people
point.
is the hammer of oppression.
Henry must have the last word.
We have, it's not often that we get to ask the President of the United States to stop speaking.
If only we could do it more often.
The legislature to speak.
Can I get an amen for that? Here in the church. Now, gentlemen, we have some really wonderful questions from the audience. And we have a lot of them. We'd like to get through as many of them as we can. And so we're going to ask if you could give a succinct answer to some of these. Some of them, of course, you could talk about for a month and a half. For example, the first question: why were the Articles of Confederation written?
Roman, you want me to take it?
Sure.
The Articles of Confederation were written in wartime. April 19, 1775, at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. And the 3 strikes of the match led to our formal divorce proceedings with the United Kingdom, which went on for 8 years. During that time, the 13 nation states that were involved in this conflict with the United Kingdom had to find a means to raise those lousy continentals that I would submit to you, sir, have the same value as the dollar will in a year. So they had to form some kind of contract, but they wanted to make sure that their particular milieu and their particular culture remained intact. The Carolinas were quite different from New York. All these, the Rhode Island, for instance, and one thing I wanted to mention very quickly about Rhode Island was the only nation state that had a plebiscite for the Constitution in 1788. They voted it down, unlike a ratification convention. This went to all eligible voters at the time. Unlike that, they voted the Constitution down 11-1 because they were frightened to death that they had fought 8 years for naught, because what they had fought against in the UK was going to be erected anew out of the ashes of what was there in 1787 and 1788 in Philadelphia. The Articles were there as a fixing process for them to have a way to communicate with each other, yet retain their sovereignty and dignity as individual entities in the British colonial area there on the East Coast.
Thank you. What were the greatest weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation?
Mark?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, at this time, I noticed my microphone is working. There were several very serious problems with the Articles of Confederation. Number one, it was almost impossible to make improvements to them because any one state could block any substantial change. So experience was of very little use to them. Secondly, there was a horribly cumbersome system in effect to try and resolve pressing problems between the various states, which could be quite jealous of each other. And putting the idea of justice between states in the hands of Congress to draw commissioners by lot and then hope for the best is not a very secure process. And the absence of any ability to come up with basic funding to see that the government can perform its most basic and essential duties, again, completely undermined faith in the future of the nation under the Articles of Confederation. We made ourselves open to attack from abroad by an inability to have a proper army to resist attacks from other nations. The Congress could stipulate how many soldiers would come to various states, and then the states could decide whether or not they would pay any attention to that. This is not a recipe for security in a world fraught with conflicts. And other issues too. Again, no chief executive who could offer support as commander-in-chief in wartime and to be a certain point of contact in our relations with nations abroad, and on and on and on. These are many of the deficiencies. And Mr. Jefferson, having lived under them, you could speak to the question further, perhaps.
Having lived under the corruptions, the tumults and calumnies of European kingdoms while they're in France, it is precisely that. It is the government of a few over a majority. It is the government of owners over tenants. It is the government of creditors over debtors. It is a government that continues to hold the people with a great delight that they remain in arrears. It is the government of nobility. It is the government of monarchy. It is the government of landed gentry, and that government protects only whom?
The Constitution.
The nobles. Our government is the first government in the history of mankind founded upon principle, not upon monarchy, nor upon aristocracy.
Thank you. A question that perhaps is a little bit more specific. How can the Federal Reserve be justified legally under our Constitution? Is there a legal justification for the Federal Reserve?
What I'd like to do is I'd like to give you some very brief thoughts about this and then ask the rest of the panelists if they'll speak to this. We are now suffering under the fourth national bank. Hamilton, that little, odd, malicious Machiavellian creature who worked for Washington, was the one who wanted us to have a constitution so that not only could he put a gun in the hands of the national state, but he could monetize our debt. And he is quoted as saying, "I think there is great glory in that national debt is a blessing." That was what Hamilton said. And that was one of the reasons why the banksters wanted the Constitution to be in place, so the federal government should charter a national bank, and so the federal government would not have competitive specie among 13 nation states, but would have one currency that they would own, that they would inflate, that they would print, and they would produce as fiat currency, being backed by absolutely nothing. Gentlemen.
Mr. Henry?
I'm not familiar with the Federal Reserve.
Federal Reserve, that is what it is called. Hamilton's idea of a national bank is now referred to as the Federal Reserve.
As a matter of fact, it became an amendment with the income tax.
With what?
The income tax amendment.
An income tax.
An income tax. Now, Mr. Jefferson, may I ask you very quickly, can you guess what the highest income tax was levied in American history?
Highest income tax? A tax upon one's income?
Yes, sir.
But what was the reason for that? I will tell you what the reason is for that, if it has occurred. More of Hamilton's schemes.
Yes, I agree with you.
Without a question, perhaps supporting a standing army in times of peace. Will that not become a business unto itself, which will need further taxes in order to support it? I remind you of the essence of Hamilton's bank bill. In fact, I ask you, if you will allow, Mr. Greeno, where in our Constitution is there even an inference for the necessity of a national bank?
Where is there anything in the Constitution that would prohibit the development of a national bank?
Ah, there you have it, exactly what the Federalists would like in our Constitution.
Well, I will say this, if I may, that the brilliant advocate of union, the acolyte of political likeness, Mr. James Madison, whom you justly revere for his intellect, was very, very shaky on his idea of supporting a national bank before he became president and before he had to assume national responsibilities as the chief executive and before he had to face a war with a foreign power. And I noticed that when he was in the federal government dealing with real-life problems, reality was a great educator to his thinking, and he came to favor a national bank.
Yes, I know. I will have to speak with you about that. Citizens, the point of the matter is simply this. Hamilton's scheme created something that is not validated by our Constitution, particularly in my opinion. It was a bank bill that was so complicated, so convoluted, that, as I said, I doubt even Hamilton himself understood it. But there was not the point of Hamilton or anyone else to understand it. The point of the matter was what? The sale. The sale to Congress, and who were the only ones capable of receiving this bank? Those who could purchase the shares in the national bank. Those, thereby, who would hold the reins of the finance of our nation to compel it to move forward in the direction they should choose, and as well appoint themselves the board of directors of such a national bank. That was the essence of his scheme.
Mr. Jefferson, the answer to that question that I asked you, sir, just for your edification.
But wait, sir. Sir,
Yes.
are you suggesting that under the Constitution, that the federal government would have the power to, by force, take a portion of our income from us that we have earned by the sweat of our brow?
If you refuse the tentacles of the IRS, you will be fined, caged, maimed, jailed, or killed. Not necessarily that way.
They can take as much as 10% of our income?
94%, sir.
Well, if there is such a thing, IRS, what does that mean?
Internal Revenue Service.
If there is such a thing as an Internal Revenue Service that is overseeing a tax upon income, well then whom do you think ought to be paying the greater tax? The farmer or the financier?
Gentlemen and ladies, there is some historical perspective to provide on the income tax. Mr. Henry was justly indignant when he said, "You mean to say that under the Constitution as you then knew it, that the federal government would have power to levy an income tax?" And you would be gratified to know, sir, that the federal government did not have that power under the Constitution as you then knew it. The exigencies of the American Civil War between the northern states and the southern states created such a huge need for revenue on the part of the federal government under President Lincoln that a revenue act was passed in 1861, which included a income tax upon individual citizens. And a few years after the Civil War itself had ended and the overt justifications for the tax having disappeared with the Peace of Appomattox, the law expired. The problem was the federal government a few years later decided to enact another ordinary statute reinstituting a federal income tax in peacetime. And it was challenged, as it should have been, as an infringement upon the Constitution as it then existed. And it was taken to the court. And the Supreme Court of last resort ruled the federal income tax statute to be unconstitutional, and it was repealed. So, how is it then today that we do have a lawful income tax which is fully comported within our new Constitution as it exists now? Because an amendment was proposed to the United States Constitution. The amendment was proposed by the properly elected representatives of the people. The people having sent those folks to Washington who came up with this idea. That amendment was then vetted by being put forth to all the various states. And as you know, if a vote of 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or if by a call of 2/3 of the existing states of the Union is forthcoming, an amendment can be proposed, and then a proposed amendment to become lawful as part of the supreme law land has to get 3/4 of the existing states to agree to it. Alas, Mr. Henry, alas, Mr. Jefferson, the due protocol was followed. This amendment became law, and that is why we have an income tax.
Mr. Greenhow doesn't make
May I thank you for pointing out the danger of our Constitution.
I say thank you for pointing out perhaps that the people have lost the hold on the reins of our government. Well, it's in the hands of financiers, it must be.
Think well on that, people. If you are not satisfied with the federal government as it is now operating, and many are not, don't be so quick to blame the Constitution for the failings of the federal government. For I do not think that is the source of our difficulty. The source of our difficulty is a growing inattentiveness to the Constitution of the United States of America. When a reporter can ask a powerful elected lawmaker whether or not proposed legislation is consistent with the Constitution, and that lawmaker can reply, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" And then move on to the next question without providing an answer. And then later, the only explanation that comes from the press secretary for that important official was, "Well, it wasn't a serious question." We are in trouble, not because of the Constitution, because of the absence of the Constitution in the lawmaking process. Mr. Jefferson, I can't forbear one more. As one professional politician says to the other professional politician about that bill you're sponsoring and its possible problems with the Constitution, don't worry, what's the Constitution between friends? Yeah.
The Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. If you had to do it over again, would you have added additional amendments to that first 10 amendments? For example, the right of women to vote.
What?
Yes, it's true. Women do vote. And by the way, did you know that now our senators are elected by popular vote, not by the state legislators?
Is that so? Well, then I
Yes, it
hope that the senators of all of our states are elected by popular vote, that we have a universal system of education to qualify and enlighten the people to that privilege and responsibility.
Would that it were so.
Could you comment on the vote of women?
May I comment on the vote of women? I would not know where to begin. Why would any lady want to dirty her delicate digits with an attention to politics is what I want to know. Is she not more important in the internal activities of the household? And I ask you, citizens, who is there when our future first opens their eyes? Is it the male? Oh no, I can assure you, he is happily on the hunt. It is our sober women folk. They are there when our future first opens their eyes, not only to supply natural succor, but to supply the very foundation of the civilizing of man. To supply that first and foremost element of leadership, compassion, followed by responsibility, not only responsibility unto one's family, one's neighborhood, one's nation, most importantly, responsibility unto one's own self. I can assure you, citizens, I have often written, our sober women folk are more responsible for the future integrity of society and our government than any male would care to admit.
But Mr. Jefferson, didn't Aristotle explain why women do not need to vote?
Yes, that's right, Henry. You read your Aristotle distinctly. You do know what he said.
Yes. Why don't you tell our good friends here tonight?
You mean you're allowing me to speak for yourself?
Mr. Jefferson, I could not stop that runaway.
I shall seize the opportunity, as Henry and I both know, and I presume you do as well. So well read you are, gentlemen. Aristotle said whenever the male becomes puffed up and thinks he's entirely the head of the household, he ought to reflect for a moment. The lady is the neck upon which his head will be turned in any direction.
Yes, I remember the question. If we were able to re-examine the original Bill of Rights and try to add something, what might that be? Well, there's actually an example of something like that that has happened. And when by the way, it was primarily leading Virginians who opened the conversation on the need for a Bill of Rights. And I want to give full credit to Mr. Patrick Henry and to his associate and colleague, Mr. George Mason of Gunston Hall in Fairfax County, for putting pressure on the people to realize that the proposed constitution for a more perfect union could in fact become a more perfect constitution with some very salutary amendments. And as the amendments went forth from Congress, after having been prepared by Jimmy Madison for that purpose, there were 12 amendments on offer, not 10.
There were 200 initially.
Well, yes, but Mr. Madison called it down, and Congress called it down even more. And the 12 amendments that went circulating amongst the states for their approbation or not included 2 that did not meet the final test of having at least 11 states give their concurrence. One of them would now be a moot point, and that was dealing with a formula for understanding representation in the House of Representatives. But the other one, which Virginia did vote for, by the way, but did not have the necessary 11 votes in total, was simply put, to prevent Congress from voting itself a raise before the next election. But better late than never. In the fullness of time, our Constitution has been amended 27 times. And the 27th Amendment, which occurred within the lifetimes of many of the people here back in the early 1990s, resurrected that idea that Congress could not vote itself a raise to take effect until an intervening election for the House of Delegates. So if at first you don't succeed, try again by the appropriate amendment process.
Which gave us the income tax and prohibition, by the way.
They undid prohibition. And I'm glad to tell you that the short-lived experiments by progressive people who thought that government could do no wrong and were looking for all sorts of ways to get away from the limits of the Constitution tried that experiment of prohibition. That didn't work out too well, as you recall.
It still isn't.
And so they amended the amendment out of existence. And I can tell you the convention that met in Virginia to consider whether or not to repeal prohibition was the shortest convention of its kind on record. They met for one day and did the deed.
Mr. Jefferson, I see you perk up when you hear prohibition.
Yes, I'm curious, prohibiting what?
Spirituous liquor.
Spiritus liquor.
Good Lord. Is that not a pleasure of life?
Even French Merlot was prohibited.
Good Lord, indeed.
I know that.
Even hemp is prohibited, Mr. Jefferson.
Why
Marijuana.
would anyone want to imbibe string and rope in the kind? I can only say this. For any government to try and prohibit something that is innate in human nature for their own particular life is futile indeed, is it not?
So you're saying it's foolish to legislate against vegetable matter?
If you were foolish to legislate against,
Yes, sir.
well, yes, where do you begin and where do you end?
That is exactly my point. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson.
Well,
This Constitution has unlimited powers.
I'm not saying that they cannot make mistakes. Of course they can make mistakes. You just heard it was repealed, did you not, Henry?
Yes, and mistakes of lives in prison or executions, Mr. Jefferson, cannot be repealed. When you give power, as Montesquieu said, when we grant titles of nobility, we know what we grant. But when we grant power, we know not what we grant. Because look what power can devolve into. The very things we've heard this evening. Now to say, well, don't worry, we can fix it. Again, why undertake something that must be fixed?
Again, Henry, it will not run rampant for too long if it remains the decision of whom you ultimately take.
Well, given that we have taxes and given that we are empowered, or they are empowered to be, they're put upon us, should the wealthy, in your opinions, be taxed more so as to assist the less wealthy, the poorer among us?
Is it not common sense? Unto those to whom much is given is not much expected. Our land is a land of plenty. Our land is not a deterrent for one to engage as much as they choose. The accrual of wealth, the accrual of happiness, and yet with great abundance. Is there not a certain civil, social, virtuous obligation to help others in their livelihood. Is that not, if you will, the message of our Lord?
But the
Mr.
question,
Jefferson,
the
would you
question
say that
is,
it would be
should,
private charity instead of government largesse that would be more efficient in handing that out? And tell me this, when they passed this income tax amendment, they started at 2 to 7% on the wealthiest people in the U.S. Everyone else was exempt. But by 1943, a mere 30 years after that, it's a 94% impost on every dollar above $100,000 that one makes in a year. 94%.
Well, who do you think brought it on? I go back to the prime mover.
Milton Friedman, as a matter of fact. You don't know that.
Speculators, stock jobbers, financiers, all of them together contrive these elements which want to accrue great moneys. And if there's an accrual of great moneys, well, then there must be some giving back in order to protect and defend the inherent right of any individual to better their own condition, not prohibit it.
All empowered by the Constitution.
Protected by the Constitution, Henry.
Evils empowered by the Constitution.
No.
Evils amplified by the Constitution. Enabling powerful and corrupt people to be more powerful and more corrupt.
Exactly.
Mark?
Free, fair, and regular election.
Oh, my God.
gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank these panelists for their